I will not do any sort of elaborate introduction today. This is a more informal affair, and I hope you'll feel that the informality is an invitation for you guys to really join in the conversation. Then we'll be giving a brief talk, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. So please join me in welcoming Ben Lerner.
Thank you. So I got nervous that I wouldn't be able to extemporize something worthy of your attention, so I wrote it all out, and now I'm nervous about that. Like that maybe that wasn't the right thing to do, but I'm going to read this talk that I've prepared, but the fact that I'm reading shouldn't keep you from feeling free to interrupt me if you want. I never gave it a title, but if you were at the reading, I think I'm both going to explicitly talk about recent writing that I've done, but also I think you'll see how the ideas I'm going to describe are not just critical ideas, but for me kind of underpin an approach to practice. So here it is. Thank you for coming. Alongside my sense of the urgency and possibilities of poetry has always been a corresponding sense of its impossibility. I don't just mean I have personally felt unequal to the art's demands, although I of course mean that too, but also that I've always worried, always wondered if a poem is not definitionally incapable of realizing the impulse out of which it arises, if there is not a principle of failure built into the practice. The poet's apology for the unworthiness of his art, for the insufficiency of his song, is traditional, generic, as is the poet's claim to renounce poetry, to break his pipe or lyre in frustration or bid farewell to his ideas. And we have no shortage of poets who claim poetry must be abolished, that the border between art and life must be erased, that the only remaining meaningful poetic gesture would be to do away with poetry altogether. With important variations, this is the rallying cry of the historical avant-garde. I think this structure of frustration we discover in so much poetry and poetry criticism should be for us a structure of fascination. Why and how is a discourse of failure constitutive of the art, not just a reason to turn away from it? And I thought we could think out loud together today about the art's deep association with the discourse of its impossibility. I thought I'd start by describing, if reductively, a particularly compelling account of the failure of all particular poems, Alan Grossman's notion of the bitter logic of the poetic principle. In his book, The Long Schoolroom, Grossman argues that poetic logic is bitter because it arises out of a desire to transcend the world of representation, but necessarily depends upon available representational techniques. He writes, "The manifest world, the only one there is subject to the logic of representation because it comes to mind only as representation. And representation, our only access to the world, reproduces its hierarchical and exclusionary structures as social formations. The poem is the site on which originality is expressed as the attempt to discover alternative structures of intelligibility that do the work of representation in another way." For Grossman, the poet always fails in this attempt because the stuff of poetry, language, invariably replicates the structures it aspires to replace. It turns out you can't do the work another way. According to Grossman, poetry arises from the desire to get beyond the violence of the human, the finite, the historical, and to reach the transcendent or divine. But as soon as the poet moves from the poetic impulse to the actual poem, the song of the infinite is compromised by the finitude of its terms. So the poet is a tragic figure. The poem is always a record of failure. There is an undecidable conflict, Grossman says, between the poet's desire for alterity and, as he puts it, the resistance to alternative making inherent in the materials of which any world must be composed. Grossman's very brilliant essays on Crane, Whitman, and others basically track the flavor, the particular bitterness of those poets' inability to actualize an alternative world through poetry. Writing on Crane, Grossman develops his notion of a virtual poem, what we might call poetry with a capital P. The abstract potentiality of the medium is felt by the poet when called upon to sing, and opposes it to the actual poem, which necessarily betrays that originary impulse when it joins the world of representation. There is always an unbridgeable gap between poetry and poems. Crane, according to Grossman, was quite literally destroyed by his refusal to separate out the virtual and the actual, by his tragic, heroic insistence on effecting their identification. Two students of Grossman's are doing interesting and sometimes, to my mind, troubling critical work, implicitly or explicitly, with his notion of the bitter logic of poetry. Oren Eisenberg, who acknowledges Grossman as a major teacher in his preface, but refers to him surprisingly little in his impressive book, Being Numerous, seems to me to be deeply indebted to Grossman's belief that all poems are failures, and that, as failures, they accomplish what social work they can through a perverse exemplarity, by being examples of what they can't quite be. Let me quote Grossman again in The Long Schoolroom, in one of many passages that might be at home in Eisenberg's book. Exemplarity, the example of examples, is one way of talking about how the poem, as failed response by its nature, accomplishes social work. A poem is like an example. Why? Because an example is always other than what it explains, as a poem is always other than the impossible work that it replaces, but shows what such work would be like. Or the poem is a translation because translations are always bad translations. Being Numerous begins by taking the following line of Oppens seriously. Because I am not silent, the poems are bad. How, Eisenberg asks, can we understand the claim that the goodness of an art is contingent on its disappearance? Eisenberg's answer is that for many 20th century poets, any poem that represents or is the occasion for the experience of particular persons fails to offer an account of personhood minimal enough to be universalizable. Eisenberg wants to shift critical emphasis from a consideration of poems as literary artifacts towards understanding poetry as an occasion for reestablishing or revealing the most basic unit of social life, the person. Many 20th century poets, according to Eisenberg, sacrifice the actual poem on the altar of poetry. As he puts it, they resist their own will to formal mastery, shy away from the sensory richness of their own strongest work, and undermine the conceptual particularity and moral exemplarity of their poetic vision. At the extremes, they long, threaten, or enjoin themselves to do away with poetry altogether. More precisely, they strive to conceive of or even produce a poetry without poems. When Eisenberg says such poets shy away from the moral exemplarity of their vision, he means poems have to be examples of an even more generalizable sort, that they want to get as far away from what Grossman called the hierarchical and exclusionary structures that language invariably reproduces. In Eisenberg's account, you might say, many poets have learned the lesson of Crane's tragedy, as understood by Grossman, and moved towards the other extreme. Instead of attempting to force the impossible identification of actual and virtual poem through mastery, they dissolve the former into the latter. They embrace poetry's bitter logic in an attempt to preserve and amplify its exemplarity in the broadest sense, to make it less the record of a particular or actual person than a model of virtual personhood. To put it too succinctly, what the poem is to poetry for Grossman, the person is to personhood for Eisenberg. Oppen's mid-career silence and Crane's suicide are, for these critics, extreme responses to the necessary failure of actual poems. Crane refused to surrender the actual into exemplarity, and it killed him, whereas Oppen's silence is the example of an exemplarity so extreme as to no longer tolerate the production of actual literary artifacts at all. Eisenberg's book, which I haven't even begun to summarize, is a brilliant instance of using Grossman's categories to justify a move away from poetry as a literary or aesthetic project in order to redraw the map of 20th century poetry around what he perceives as a common ontological project, which he, much more than Grossman, historically situates. But Grossman's bitter categories of the virtual and the actual don't necessarily involve distancing from literary artifacts. For instance, another student of Grossman's, Michael Clun, has produced beautiful and insightful readings of the contemporary prose poem in relation to Grossman's notion of the virtual. Prose poetry, you might say, is the generic literalization of the apparently paradoxical goal of poetry without poems. Explicitly evoking Grossman's notion of the virtual in a recent essay on prose poetry, Clun writes, "The prose poem is a virtual poem. Its way of ending, its closure, lies outside of poetry, outside of aesthetic form. The prose poem is a quasi-form. It is a place to plot out a form that works, a form that will make something happen." A prose poem for Clun is a not yet poem that hasn't quite succumbed to the bitter logic of the poetic principle. It's a kind of Bartleby of genre that would prefer not to cross the threshold into actuality where poetry makes nothing happen, as Auden said. Writing about a prose poem of Cyrus Consul's, Clun observes, one way the prose poem accomplishes this distance, that is the distance between the virtual and the actual, is by inclusion, the most elementary mode of transcendence. Cyrus Consul's prose, for example, often includes couplets. In several prose poems, Consul includes a rhymed couplet by using the conventional mark for quoting a line break, the slash. The steam went to tears at the glass, slash, when she stepped from the bath. At the simplest level, this notation signifies that the space that includes the couplet is not a poem but something else. But what? What does this inclusion mean? One way to interpret it would be to think of Consul's prose poem as a blueprint for a poem. This is still Clun, by the way, that I'm quoting. The slash would thus serve as a kind of precise formal instruction for making the finished poem, while the remainder of the prose might be thought of as listing content to be given form. This is a fiction, of course. I don't think Clun thinks anybody tries to build anything from Consul's blueprint. But it's an enabling or necessary fiction that suspends the actuality of the couplet it nevertheless presents. And I evoke Clun on Consul because I think it shows how Grossman's categories can be used to yield insights about specific literary techniques. Not all kinds of writing fail, that is, become actual in the same way. I think Clun's attention to Consul's writing helps us ask a question that goes something like this. What are the strategies available to writers for defeating or at least deferring actuality? The prose poem is one. Are there ways of contesting the bitter logic of the poetic principle that aren't suicidal, Grossman's image of Crane, or sacrificial in Eisenberg's sense? Let me stay with the slash or the virgule for a minute. I think that's how you say that. I've never actually said out loud the name of the slash. I think it's virgule. Does that sound right?
That's right.
We'll pretend it's virgule at least. The first poem in Donald Allen's The New American Poetry, which, as you know, is this inestimably influential analogy for poets, is Charles Olson's The Kingfishers, a poem that for many and in many ways marks the threshold of post-war American poetry. It's a poem whose title and central figure evokes and inverts a major motif in the wasteland, and whose enjambment and assemblage, an attempt to gather a live tradition from diverse materials, is obviously indebted to the cantos. And yet, in its refusal of modernist nostalgia or totalizing ideologies, it seeks to recover poetic experiment from the surpassing disasters of modernity. We all know its first line. What does not change, slash, is the will to change. But for my part, I'm not sure if this is one line of poetry or two lines or zero. That is it actually one line of verse or is it two lines of verse presented as citation? The slash exists in pound. Olson is copying it from the Pisan cantos, that maggot should slash eat the dead bullock. And Pound is copying it, according to Guy Davenport, from John Adams' letters, where such abbreviations were common. So the virgule itself is being quoted, troping the tradition, so to speak. Olson, in projective verse, describes that slash as a pause so light it hardly separates the words, as a mechanical advantage the typewriter offers for a poet who wants something softer than a comma, and so makes the virgule as much about a new mechanical compositional present as it is about the evocation of an archival past. That it is both these things, archival citation and mechanical experiment, is apt for the Heraklean flux. But for my purposes, I want to note that here, at the beginning of post-war American poetry, we don't exactly have a poem at all. We have something that can be read, cannot not be read on some level, especially coming from a poet critic who was a critic first, as a citation or example of a poem. The opening line or lines raise a question like the question Clun asks about prose poetry. What kind of space is this? I'd say open field poetry, despite all its emphasis on exactness of measure, somatic immediacy, etc., wants to be, like many post-war poetries, a virtual space, not yet or not just an actual poem. Olson selecting and foregrounding the virgule as link with Poundian experiment seems particularly significant in this context because it's a way of evoking Pound's formal innovation in a manner that simultaneously signifies a refusal of the poet's disastrous attempt to actualize his poetics as politics. Let me also observe that Olson's desire to make this mechanical glyph about speech, about scoring the breath, allows us to think about the phonocentrism of the lyric tradition in terms of its desire to avoid the bitterness of the actual. Whether it's the traditional vocative O or Olson's virgule as mechanical registration of subtle somatic variations, maybe we should think of the emphasis on vocalization less as a claim about the beauty of speech and song and more as a strategy for protecting the virtuality of the text, of making all written artifacts blueprints in Clun's sense, or at least transcripts. The privileging of the vocalized would then really be a way of protecting the written from mere actuality, and the virgule another order of tactical retreat, notes for a text which is a score for the breath. Another example of a formal acknowledgement and tactical response to the failure of the merely actual can be found in Jack Spicer's poetry, and perhaps the most exemplary instance in Spicer would be in the well-known opening to Thing language, which I'll read in a second. I select Spicer as an example over scores of other writers who might equally serve as examples. And I've been thinking lately of Barbara Guest and Meme Bursenbrugge very much in the terms I've been using, because the particular Spicerian tactic I'm going to describe foreshadows something like what I'd like to say about what I'd like to say regarding my own work, such as it is. But here's the Spicer. Do you guys know this poem Thing language? I'll read it quickly. This ocean, humiliating in its disguises, tougher than anything. No one listens to poetry. The ocean does not mean to be listened to. A drop or crash of water. It means nothing. It is bread and butter, pepper and salt, the death that young men hope for. Aimlessly, it pounds the shore, white and aimless signals. No one listens to poetry. In Spicer's poetry, we often experience the left margin more intensely than the right. Terminal punctuation near the right margin, as in lines 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the poem I just quoted, and 8, means that most of the subsequent sentence is suspended across the line break, making us experience predication or the introduction of the subject, depending on syntax, as delayed. Furthermore, the words at the left margin of a Spicer poem tend either to be monosyllabic or trochaic, tougher, nothing, pepper. This is so often the case that reading serially, one begins to form the habit of stressing the first syllable. And there are entire books of Spicers in which the first word at the left margin is either a monosyllabic word or a trochee. This habit is furthered by Spicer's use of capital letters at the left margin, a constant of his verse, and by the frequency with which his lines end on falling cadences. It is almost as if the line break is experienced at the left margin, where the momentum of the previous line breaks as a wave breaks against the vertical axis of the poem. In thing language, this weighting produces the significant ambiguity in the last and jam sentence. We can hear both the despairing refrain, "No one listens to poetry," and "one listens to poetry," as if the left margin has dissipated the negative, transforming the absence of the reader into a presence and asserting the possibility of poetic transmission via the poem's objective form, its thing language, over and against its referential content. We might say the actuality of the sentence is suspended by the polysemy introduced by lineation. Grossman and Eisenberg and Clun can help us attend to the variety of tactics poets have for defeating or deferring actuality. And my way of talking here is very roughly analogous, as suggested by my use of the word defeating, to how Michael Fried, whose most recent book, by the way, is dedicated to Grossman, conceives of works of visual art as defeating their objecthood, or at a specific moment of French painting, defeating theatricality through the depiction of figures engaged in scenes of absorption. The strategic retreat to the quasi-form of the prose poem, the incorporation of the virgule into the poem in order to charge it with virtuality, the delay and dissipation at the left margin of Spicer. These are instances of writers acknowledging, another key word for Fried, and also to a certain extent thereby escaping Grossman's bitter logic. Against this, of course, imperfectly sketched critical backdrop, I thought I'd now turn to my own work and talk a little bit about how I have experienced and attempted to evade the bitterness of poetic logic, how I found myself trying to keep faith with the virtual from within the literary artifact, certainly not because I think I succeed where others fail or necessarily fail better, but just because I can speak out of a firsthand sense of how those pressures have registered for me in the act of composition. Anyway, I'll say something about my most recent published book of poems, Mean Free Path, although this way of talking about the actual and the virtual organizes my novel and is certainly at play in the other poems I've written. Mean Free Path, which in physics describes the average distance a particle travels before colliding with another particle, is very much concerned with failure, with how poetry can track failures of representation, hesitation, doubling back, interruption, etc., in a manner that more accurately measures the experience of speaking and thinking in time than facile resolution. And while writing this book, I often thought of Creeley's poem, For Love, how the speaker's failure to figure his emotional state becomes a compelling figure for his emotional state, an expressive failure of expression. And Mean Free Path is a book of love poems, or a book about the possibility of the contemporary love poem, which means I wanted to find a form that avoided both the flight into mere procedure and the safely limited longing of the univocal lyric subject. Order and disorder were equal threats, to paraphrase Valeray. The poems are full of stutters. The last word of one line is often the first word of the next, and fragmentation. Some lines just break off, or interruptions. There are quick changes of direction, producing unlikely juxtapositions, but these aren't surrealist chance meetings so much as records of distraction or quick shifts of perspective. But the technique I wanted to discuss in relation to the virtual and the actual is the way that lines are often out of order or belong to several possible orders simultaneously. In a given stanza, what might seem like an abandoned false start might be picked up later in the stanza, or in the next stanza, a later page, even a later section, or what seems like the predicate of one sentence might become across the margin the subject of another, or a line might have a variety of possible continuations, might link up with more than one subsequent or previous line, and the reader is either to select an order or to linger among a plurality of orders. If nothing else, the reader's forced to read her reading, to experience her participation in the construction of meaning, to collaborate in the articulation of the stanzaic space. And I thought I should adduce an example, even if a single example is necessarily misrepresentative because of the way the poem's recombinations and lines reappear with a difference across the sequence. But in the handout, there's a poem from Mean Free Path, which I'll read. It's just the top part, which I'll read, and then we can talk about that other stanza in a second. So this is from Mean Free Path. I know it's full of flowers, music, stars, but the pressures under which it fails, how it falls apart if read aloud, or falls, what we might call its physics, together like applause, a false totality, scales. The words are just there to confuse the censors, like mock eyes on the wing, except for Adi. No energy is lost if they collide, the censors inside me, and that's love, and that's elegy. I know I am a felt. This is the form where my friend is buried, effect of the things that I take personally, a gentle rippling across the social body. I know that I can't touch her with the hand that has touched money. I mean, without several competing forms of closure, irony, now warm and capable of decay on strings as we descend. The poem moves from a stuttering apology for its romantic vocabulary to a description of its own procedures. And perhaps you can hear, although I think it's easier to see, how the lines can belong to various orders. So looking at the last stanza, for example, several competing forms of closure initially seems to be a continuation of the two preceding lines. I know I can't touch her with the hand that has touched money, I mean without. But the next line, beginning with irony, disrupts this linear reading. Now it seems that the most coherent sequence is, I know I can't touch her with the hand that has touched money, I mean without irony, now warm and capable of. And the reference to Keats's This Living Hand also focuses attention on that linkage. Meanwhile, several competing forms of closure now appears to connect with decay on strings as we descend, but the last line can also link up with the penultimate line, and thus the fifth line, the hand now warm and capable of decay. However, the penultimate line could also be read as a fragment, as just breaking off, which happens elsewhere in the sequence, and these multiple orders also compete with the stanza's sonic organization, a long E that ripples across the stanza, elegy, buried, personally, rippling, body, money, competing, irony, a musical ordering like standing waves decaying on vibrating strings, another kind of line that expresses through tension and oscillation. So instead of imagining closure in the act of performance, this poem falls apart, or at least claims to fall apart when read aloud, when a linear reading in time forecloses the plurality of possible orders. And yet its sonic attributes are precisely what secure this particular order, what allows it to fall together. And I like to think of the poem then as hesitating or oscillating between the written and the vocalized, without either of those forms ever becoming actual. And that standoff charges the poem with the glimmer of abstract possibility, despite being a particular material instantiation. And the idea that some reader at some point could articulate the poems in a different way again evokes Clun's metaphor of the blueprint. Or you could say that the assertion of this order as one of multiple possibilities is an assertion of exemplarity. This is an example of a poem made out of these lines. I might also mention that many people have said, and I never know if this is a compliment or an insult, that reading Mean Free Path makes them feel there was some linear poem I then cut up and rearranged to form the book, and that they intuit without ever quite being able to piece back together that ghostly presence of the original. And there isn't an original, but that doesn't mean it isn't a present absence. And I like to think of that as another way the poem avoids becoming merely real and keeps in contact with virtual possibility. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, this is a fiction, right? That the poem and I advance about the poem. An enabling fiction, I hope, that allows the poem to position itself in the gap between the actual and the virtual. And if nothing else, I hope I'm indicating how one poet responds to a sense of the insufficiency of all empirical poems without giving up, or can try to make the formal dramatization of failure a figure for what it cannot actually achieve, as in Critic. So looking back over the book while preparing these notes, I was re-encountering my use of the word virga several times in the book, a kind of keyword in the book, which I don't know if you know what virga is. It's that visible precipitation that streaks from a cloud, but that evaporates before it hits the ground. So there's another stanza that's just one example of where the word virga appears. And it's hard to quote aloud because of the competing orders of the lines, but here it is. How the eye moves constantly to keep light from the object falling gently on a little clearing. They call this, like rain that never reaches ground, reading, like birds that lure predators away, virga, or the failure of the gaze to reach by faking injury, like flares that bend across the lake in total dark, missiles from their path. Here the line, like rain that never reaches ground, can connect with light from the object falling, or describe reading, or itself seem to just evaporate before the possibility of, they call this virga, is discovered in the sixth line. And I just wanted to end by noting that virga and virgule both come to us from the same Latin term for little rod, the mark for verse that is not yet or no longer or not merely actual, a rainfall that never quite closes the gap between heaven and earth, phenomena whose failure to become or remain fully real allows them to figure something beyond the phenomenal. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. We've got the floor open to questions now. And if you came in late and if you're hungry, there's food. You could help yourselves. But yeah, any questions or comments? Yeah, Stephanie.
Ben, your discussion of the, thank you, that was really nice.
Thank you.
Your discussion of the poem and the ghostly original in your work made me think of Ted Berrigan's sonnets, and the way it's the number 12 or something actually has an order that you can put the sonnets in, but
Right.
that I sometimes think he threw that in just to kind of mess with the reader, so that the reader is always looking for a similar kind of system or procedure elsewhere in the book and can't find it.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking about how one of the other ways he reinforces that is through repetition across the book. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit about repetition and whether this is one of these kind of techniques that you're talking about for skirting the virtual and the actual.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a really great example, and I think an example that matters to me. I mean, there's that poem, right, which is the Joe Brainerd collage poem, right, where the last line of the sonnet, I guess, is right in the middle, because you have to read the first line and then the last line and then the second line and the penultimate line, and then you work your way to the middle. And one great thing about that poem that I think links, and part of why your question is really useful for me, is it reminds me of how both repetition and that disorder in the poem are ways of troubling closure in the sonnets for Berrigan.
Yeah, I was also thinking about how repetition is maybe one of the kind of more virtual methods too that you're talking about. So how it's useful because it, instead of being a kind of hard left trochaic front end or something, it can be both kind of melodic and virtual, but also.
That's right, yeah. And the other thing about repetition, I think that's really useful in this context, right, is that it's impossible. Like, that a word, the return, the repetend always has a difference by virtue of the history in the context of the word, right? You experience the second instantiation as meaningfully different from your first encounter. So it's a way of making both the first and second instance of the term suddenly feel tentative or provisional. And that's certainly both a way of troubling closure, but a way of creating a sense of testing or provisionality, which does make poems feel exemplary, right? It's a way of, like, this is one example of a place I could put this word, and then here's another example later in the sequence, and so then all the words start to feel, they start to have that kind of like aura of attentiveness or virtuality. But your question also points to that weird, I mean, as you put it, like that weird fact that like the refrain is both a closural technique, right? I mean, like the heroic couplet is what, it's like that kind of sonic parallelism is what snaps a poem together, but it also is always threatening to undo closure by opening up the possibility of repetition that could move beyond that instant. So yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, a really good example. And I am not really able to write without repetition, I think, because it's what allows me to feel like I don't have to make the perfect decision in any given instance, which I'm never capable of making, because there's always this chance for recombination or a return with a difference.
Just in the process of composing mean-free path, you were talking about like the recontextualization by different instantiations and the repetition. Did you ever like reviewing through different poems, would you ever look at two completed poems and revise them, looking at them juxtaposed against each other, or like make these instantiations of repetitions like kind of after the fact of composing both of them?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like cutting and pasting and finding and so like all those word processing techniques that I can't write without them. That idea of, I mean, both having a technology that aids in recursive editing, but also my kind of interest in the sequence means that a lot of the expansion of a work is what you can write back in, as opposed to just what you can write forward. And I'm not dogmatic about it's not like the way I think poems should be written. It just seems to be like the only thing I can do. Although I'm trying to do something kind of different now. I'm not even really very different, but I mean, the poem's very different, but they still kind of rely on that. And I mean, I also, how like you're writing and you start to see a tendency that was fortuitous, like you didn't actually intend it, but then you will it as the sequence goes on, and then you can say, okay, this is going to be a feature. This is going to become a constitutive moment of the text as opposed to just a contingent element of it. And it's kind of like, I don't know until kind of I'm fully in a sequence what's going to become like a candidate for repetition. Or I often don't decide, like it comes back. Like night vision green and green as a color became really organized mean-free path a lot, right? Like the color of money, the color of pastoral, the green place of the idyllic poetic world, but also then this military technology, which, makes the world a target. And so on like that, I didn't I wasn't planning to do that until these like different green places kept returning in the work. And then you kind of own it and pretend you meant to do it and can use it to elaborate the sequence. But a lot of that means that like I'm discovering on page 18 something I want to pretend I was aware of all along, so then I feed it back into an earlier moment in the sequence.
I've never heard the word verb before, but you called it variable something like mechanical lift. And in at least I'm not sure about all your books of poetry, but definitely in Lincolnburg and Main Street Path, you kind of have those like little glyphs or something like that, little symbols that separate the poems or do something like that. Just wondering if I've seen reviewers like take those into consideration in the books and stuff. I was just wondering if you had anything to say about the inclusion of those, or if they're significant to you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, they are significant to me. I don't have very much interest. I don't have anything sophisticated to say about the particular material glyph that's being used, but the idea of using a typographical mark that is not a letter as a way of organizing or disorganizing space or pacing within the book as a phenomenal form is really important to me. I mean, like in these, in Mean-Free Path, I'm sure I was kind of aware of the broken infinity symbol looking thing of the glyph, but more important to me was a way of raising the question about what a poem is. Like, is it two poems on a page? Is it one poem that's in sections separated by a glyph? Is the book one poem, and are those just marks separating stanzas? So the glyph is often a way to think about, to like kind of foreground part-whole relationships within a sequence, and to kind of to activate the degree to which that's a problem for the reader, like the question of what's a discrete unit or what's an item in a shifting sequence. So I think that's and then there are moments when I've thought it was important to get away from them. Like I have like an angle of yaw where I don't use it, or like in these poems where there aren't numbers separating the pages of the poems. I mean, that's a very different feeling. And part of what I wanted to do there was make the page break a felt break. I mean, I think like a lot of writers don't have anything to say about the page break, which is very strange to me, right? Because like the line break and the stanza break are kind of virtual, and then the page break is both in the world of the poem and a phenomenal fact of reading, at least in a codex, right? Not online. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Angle of Yas starts by talking about that. And so those different ways of dividing the page are ways of trying to kind of draw attention to both the phenomenology of reading and that part-whole relationship complex, which seems to me to be so much of what poetry is about, right? Like line, stanza, poem, sequence of poems, self, collectivity, whatever.
You mentioned the glyph that separates a lot of the stanzas in mean free path. In statistics, it's used to indicate linearly proportional to.
Right.
Did you do that on purpose? Because I thought that was
No, I was told, but then I was told that, and I kind of pretended that I did. I mean, I remember talking to. I mean, I also think that's a pretty glyph, without being too loud. But I mean, I have this thing that's both sloppy and deliberate, which is this kind of metaphorization of the sciences, right? Or the metaphorization of kind of like more like languages that purport to greater objectivity. Like, I mean, I know nothing about the sciences, but I have 3 books that kind of metaphorize tropes from this. So I was kind of aware of its resonances without having like without that being kind of part of the project, and more kind of like a fortuitous kind of noise. I'm really in trouble when people ask me about, like, to explain the physics of mean free path more than as a trope. And I have an uncle who's like a particle physicist who's really angry about it. Like, he thinks this is what's wrong with the world, is that poets use scientific language. And I think what's wrong with the world is that scientists don't think their language is metaphorical, right? So that they're not called upon to account for the ideologies that underpin their way of measuring the universe. I just said that to my uncle, kind of, while looking at you, like but that is kind of what's happening with the sciences and stuff. Yeah.
So, I want to ask about music. It seems like, in looking carefully at these passages from Mean Free Path, that there's kinds of musical structure of like modern music seem like apparent in the kind of way that themes and motifs circulate in new positions and combinations and create new melodic or kind of structural things, and that model might be a way of thinking about the virtual versus the actual, because like people talk about poetry in terms of painting, when they're trying to emphasize the kind of actuality of poetry, the ability of poetry to give representations and things like that, but that music, the music model might align upon, you can read a poem against that model that would map onto the virtual more, right? And so I'm just wondering if first of all, if what you have to say about a musical structure, how that plays a role in your practice, if any, particular piece of music or whatever, and then I have a question about the closure of Mean Free Path too, because in the end of Mean Free Path, those motifs, to me, very beautifully come together. Several different motifs that had been kind of floating through the piece come together into syntactical closure, right? In a way that's I found very powerful, but in some ways militates against the idea of that you're describing aiming for.
Right.
So.
Well, I mean, to start with the question of closure, I think that the goal, right? I mean, the goal is that it is to achieve these, it is to achieve closure, but to achieve closure in a way that still retains exemplarity, like as one possible kind of closure. And part of how the book tries to do that is like in the Doppler elegies that end the book, right? There is this really, I mean, there is like kind of a dramatic closural moment, but it's made exclusively out of language found elsewhere in the book. Yeah. So it's not the kind of closural moment that the traditional idea of closure, like the completion of an utterance or a song, so much as an instance of working with materials that have a history in the volume. So I feel like to me at least, there's a felt difference to closure when it feels like the function of collage, and closure when it feels like kind of immediate utterance or something. So I agree and wonder if there's a difference, because like at some points in the book, even the most kind of direct modal first person statements are complicated by the fact that the language has a history in the book. Like the sentences will be made out of lines that are taken from elsewhere. And I just think of that as realistic, right? Like just the sense that even in our most like intimate utterances, it is language with the social history, you know, and not language that we like have invented, right? So that's kind of like general thought about the closure. I mean, about music, you're right. I mean, it is similar to the sciences. Like I can't tell. Like it's an interesting thing about music and poetry. When I listen to people talk about the musicality of poetry, I often can't tell when it's metaphor and when it's a literal claim about the text. And I'm kind of interested in that slippage, right? Like when do we mean the poem is like music, and when do we actually mean it's an instance of music? And since these poems both rely a lot, like any poem, on sonic attributes of the text, but are constantly claiming not to be vocalizable, the poems are invested in this kind of myth of being a score that can't be performed. So that music is the glimmer of the virtual, right? In that sense, while the poems insist they can't be actualized, which is not like I say that and then I read them, right? And I wouldn't read them if I really thought they offered nothing when read aloud. It's more this fiction as I was describing it. So I'm very uneducated about like actual musical structure, but certainly basic concepts in modern music feel to me often like more effective ways of describing poems, and within poems describing the tension between textuality and orality than a lot of the language we normally bring to bear on written texts. Even motif, right? Or just a sensitivity to how dissonance is a felt effect of the assumption of harmony as a model, right? So that idea of atonality is requiring a history of tonality in order to be perceptible is an important way of thinking for me as, like I think about a poem. But I'm probably the least educated person in the room about like actual musical structure. I mean, it's also weird. Like I come from a family not of like classically trained, but everybody is like good, can like pick up an instrument and figure out how to do something with it. And I took violin lessons as a little kid in Topeka and was like heroically terrible. I was like really into it, But I've never. I mean, I have these like weird, like I can't remember lyrics set to music as effectively as I can remember them when they're not set to music, which I don't think is the way it's supposed to work. Like, isn't the whole point of music that it has this mnemonic function? So, but that, the unavailability of certain actual musical practice for me has pushed me into an interest of it. And it's like in Zukowski, it's an upper limit. Like it's never quite achieved. And that thing, like talking that yesterday, like in that poem I read, like I'm interested in, poetry's association with song, which we also sometimes mean literally and sometimes mean metaphorically or whatever, but also that Cadman moment that matters so much to Grossman, matters to many people, but matters so much to Grossman, right, where the first poet in English is called upon to sing and is embarrassed. He doesn't know any songs and he withdraws, and then the gods come to him. So there's been some way that I've always associated my embarrassment with music as somehow related to being a poet, although I know great poets who are also great musicians or whatever. But that's how I have like re-described my failing as part of something.
Violinist, yeah.
Right, that's it.
So this is all just a huge reaction formation about
Yeah,
your
basically.
music lessons.
That's basically. They used to put I remember my violin teacher, and we weren't allowed to have like sugary cereals in the house, but if you held your bow properly, she would put this like Fruit Loop on the end of the bow, and then if you held it properly, you could eat the Fruit Loop, and my brother and I were basically in it for the Fruit Loops. Although he's like a really good musician. But.
That's how they teach parrots to play the violin too.
Probably, yeah.
I have a favorite quote from Valerie that listening to poetry set to music is like looking at a painting through stained glass. And I wondered what you thought about poetry set to music. Say, jazz bands playing behind the scene, playing poetry, or art song that is made for poems.
Yeah, that's a great quote and a good question. I mean, there's so many different things under that word poetry. Like, I would be, like, for me, the idea of, I would be happy to release a text I wrote to a musician who was going to do something interesting with it, but I would never be able to think of it as, like, accompaniment. It would be a whole new thing. But I do know, because for me, like, the music is in the work, right? So it would be kind of crossing these two different orders. But then I guess, there are poets who I think work with musical accompaniment in interesting ways. I wouldn't like kind of generally discount it, but it does fill me with like terror, the idea if I were like told to do it. In part because like part of the thing about music for me, and this is how it like holds this virtual position, is I've always thought of it as like it's too powerful, right? Like I can't, like I've never understood like background music. Like I don't, like. And so like if I'm like we're at home and like Adriana will like put on Nina Simone while she does things, and I'll just be like, I won't be able to do anything because it's just like in the room or whatever. So I just feel like that music would overwhelm the technology that I'm using, to set it to music, and that's not a critique of either technology. Like that there are things that the relative quietness of poetry can do as a result of the felt silence of the page that's its backdrop, and there's some music that's very similar. But setting it to music sounds like a tragic identification of the virtual and the actual to me. To use those other terms that would like obliterate both somehow.
Yeah, Susan Howe is coming here on the 26th of February to read a piece that she did collaboratively with the musician David Grubbs. So that would be.
And that's an amazing piece, right? And that's a good example of an instance where I feel like the work really. Part of it is, I don't know if you've seen Susan read, but like, I heard the recording first of this collaboration, and I thought her voice was totally digitally manipulated because I couldn't imagine her making these sounds. And then I saw it live, and it's like actually like some of them are digital fragments, and some of them are just like this thing she can do. She seems like possessed when she does it. It's really beautiful. But like that collaboration, is an electronic musician using sound elements in a kind of conversation with a text, and they've kind of spoken back to each other, and it's very impressive to me. But part of what's impressive about it is that David Grubbs is very good at using sound in a way that amplifies silence. Like you hear this kind of feedback and noise. That's the archive. That like, I don't know how to. You'll see when she comes. That's a really good example of it.
I had a question about the Autotune poem.
Yeah.
I first read it in Almost Island. I was really surprised because it's not nearly as disjunctive as the other poetry, and it's more like propositional, and it's like it's discursive and almost didactic in a way that seems is really engaging with Alan Grossman's ideas about like speaking with the whole throat and kind of I don't know, lots of Grossman's poetry itself is very, like borders on like being didactic and like, I don't know, it seemed like there was an interesting interplay with you moving over into a more conversational kind of, or not even conversational, but like incantory mode. And I wanted to know what you thought about that in relation to like the idea of a period style, where like disjunction in American poetry is kind of the norm, and the like what you talk about in autotune with correcting to like a normal pitch, stuff like that. I don't know, it's not very, I don't have like a well thought out question.
No, there are a lot of good questions. I mean, I think that, not that this matters, but I think it, like I wrote this poem called Didactic. Like I always have been kind of interested in the didactic as one mode, although you're right that like the new stuff is much more, like the sentence is a different kind of unit, with the exception of like one or two poems. But you mentioned it both being didactic and incantatory, and what I'm interested in is this weird way that the long line in poetry kind of signifies both those things at once, even though they should be contradictions, right? Like incantatory is something we associate with song, and didactic is in poetry, and didactic is usually something we associate with like an anti-lyrical, prosaic mode. And I got really interested in how, like in Whitman, there are two ways to view that line, that's always crossing the right margin and having to be indented because no book can hold it or whatever. And one way, which is like the main way he would talk about it, is about the like overflowing of the Victorian restraint of, pentameter, right? Like it's like big country, big line kind of stuff, and like overflowing the like, the restrictions of pentameter. And like it is that in a way, but then there's this other dream for that line, which is that it almost becomes prose and demotic and the language of information. And I think what's weird and interesting about Whitman is how it skirts that boundary between exuberance and flatness. And that I got interested in a long line for similar reasons, like to really bring that out, like to really play with the difference between the incantatory powers of verse and the flatness of prose. And that part of that is a way of saying that I'm interested in a line that's almost prose because it returns to that notion of the virtual. Like it's almost not a line. It like has some of that blueprint for a line, or it's like a placeholder for a poetry that isn't possible yet, in a certain sense, like an auto-tune, right? It's like waiting for this voice that could sing again with particularity, but until that time is writing in the kind of normativity of prose as a way of making the pleasures or powers of verse felt as a loss, if you know what I mean. So, and I'm also interested in that really long line in which the line break becomes virtualized because of the objective dimensions of the page, right? So that you don't actually experience the line break like when you read the Library of America edition of Whitman, because the break of the line is an effect of the right margin of a dimension of the text, right? And almost every time you encounter Whitman, like you read across it and you see that indentation because it's a run-over line, which I think of as virtualizing. Like it's almost like the image of a line of poetry that's not been able to be presented to you as poetry because it exceeds the limits of the codex or whatever. So that became another site of kind of virtuality or actuality. And like Meme Bursenbrugge's really long line is interesting to me because I can't really tell when she's just let the right margin break it and when she's made a decision. Like when it's a decision, it's an objective decision of the book as an artifact and a subjective, decision of the writer. So when Barbara Guest talks about her perilously long line, I think the peril is that there's a game of chicken between the extension of the line and the right margin. And sometimes like she lets herself lose and sometimes she breaks it just before. And Whitman didn't want to enjam his lines because the unity of that syntax was supposed to be mimetic of like union, right? I mean, it was supposed to be like federalism, like all these different things held together in these gigantic syntactic catalogs. So that was, I don't know if I did a very good job with that question, which is an important one, but in the question, that moment where you were talking both about the didactic and the incantatory, that's exactly the tension that I'm interested in that really long line.
Our kind of recognition that building something that's completely artificial and kind of admits that it's artificial can kind of be an answer to that failure. That would be my kind of argument. I was kind of wondering what you thought of that.
That's right. I mean, and this kind of relates also to what you were talking about, like the disjunction that's typical of a lot of poetry. I mean, so the avant-garde dream is typically that you have to overcome artifice, right? That you have to obliterate the distinction between art and life. I mean, like if you think about what modernism is supposed to do in poetry, I mean, it depends on the modernist, right? Like not Stevens, but if you think about like Pound, like, you know, Pound is like, get Mussolini on the phone, make me Minister of Culture, and like the cantos that is this kind of amalgamation of all these significant cultural details is going to be like the blueprint for the new society. Like you're supposed to overcome the gap between art and life and instantiate it as politics. And this, of course, like led to lots of right-wing, like Yeatsian disasters. But then, like for a lot of us, like, you know, language poetry, which is to me a really significant movement, like it also was a kind of anti-aesthetic, anti-expressive position in which you're supposed to get rid of the aesthetic in order to actually work on the world. Like that the experience of defamiliarization and grammatical derangement and the interruption of the will to integration or whatever makes, like, it deconstructs the ideological machinery that underpins like the war in Vietnam, right? Like that's the function of it. Like the categories of beauty or whatever, even when it is beautiful, like those aren't the categories that the most avid proponents of language poetry are talking about, right, at the time the movement is happening. So that is to say that the avant-garde tradition in many ways, despite all the like artifice and the posturing, right, is very much an anti-art. It's about the obliteration of art, overcoming the division of art into life. So I'm actually kind of less and less interested in that and more interested in this other strain of like left poetics that says it's precisely the difference between the art object and reality and the way it can make you feel that difference that opens up a possibility for a new kind of conceptual activity. And that feeds back into praxis, right? Like that it allows you to use an otherwise atrophying sense. It exercises a certain formal capacity that you would need to act in the world or grasp emergent opportunities, but that you don't, in order to have it feed back into practice, you can't try to force the identification of the aesthetic or the artificial and the real. So yeah, I mean, the more optimistic way to describe Grossman's binary, I think you're absolutely right, is to say, well, and I think sometimes he's saying this and sometimes he's not. I mean, I don't even know when I'm like often not understanding him, even though I'm really kind of inspired by it. But he has it in this really tragic mode. But you could translate the same vocabulary into a left aesthetics mode that says the value of art is precisely that it negatively figures a virtual possibility that isn't real. It doesn't claim to become the change or whatever. It doesn't become utopia, but it's a utopian glimmer of possibility because you experience through the encounter of the artwork something other than the rationalization of what merely is. So that opening up that space through artifice is what is that like utopian glimmer. I believe that, I think. And a really interesting critic who I didn't talk about, I mean, I have this kind of like irresponsible relationship to poetry criticism because I don't feel like professionally obliged to stay current about it, but a lot of my friends are critics, a lot of people I'm in conversation with are critics, but I think a very interesting critic is Robert Kaufman, who's at Berkeley, who is writing about what he calls this negative romanticism, right? And he has this concept called lyric stretching, and he talks about how before, like that stroke victims often can learn how to sing again before they can learn how to speak again, and that what poetry does is like stretches the conceptual material, the material of conceptuality itself, which is language. It stretches it in the artwork in a way that you could then bring to bear on the world. Now, I think it gets complicated when he tries to adduce examples of this, even though he's a brilliant reader. It's kind of hard to like say, this is me before the poem and this is me when I've been stretched. right? But it, you know, he's making this kind of revisionist, powerful revisionist argument, which is that the avant-garde that wants to link itself to Benjamin and Adorno and Brecht is actually kind of wrong about what they said about aesthetics. Like they believed, in a way, in aesthetic experience, even though they were also critical of it, because that's what opens up the possibilities, the conceptual possibilities for grasping the emergent. You know, like you need, like Marx needs to read Shelley to become Marx or something like that. You know, I mean, there are probably other examples, but. So yes, I agree with, I really agree with what you're saying.
What you're saying, I'm glad you said that because it reminded me just what you were talking about with you know, the language school and the avant-garde ideal of like the aesthetic and like being the same thing basically. But well, I guess this question is founded on a easier question maybe. So in the novel you just put out, there's that whole, there's like a 10-page sequence or something of lead character having what's that called? Not text message, instant message conversation. And I was told, you know, like through hearsay, that this was a real interaction, I guess, that you would just sort of taught and put into the text. So I don't know if that's true or not. That's going into my thinking for this question. So, and then, you know, the whole novel is just sort of about like the intersections of art and life and the messiness there, you know, the problems, you can get into that. But then when I've read your books in the order they were published in. When you're reading from reading through Path yesterday, I started hearing some things that I didn't hear upon reading it, which was, it sounded like referring to quoting this instant message dialogue. Like there was something in the Inquiry Path that was like, I quoted it verbatim, or you know, and like it sounded like with regret, things like that. So what all that's just getting to say is, like you know, whether that's the case or not, you definitely deal with some really direct things in your life, some very personal things that affect other real people in your life too. Just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. Like that's always a real risky business, and I think you handle it really well, but it's a fine line to walk. And since you wrote kind of a whole novel that regards that, if you can just talk a little bit about that. This is sort of big, grandiose question.
Yeah, no, I mean, the novel, there's all kinds of like true stuff in the novel, like the apartment the character lives in was my apartment. Like I had like all these, you know, really obvious, like not inside, like these things that like everybody knows I had never thought of. Like, oh, you can write a novel and like the building can be real and the events in the building can be made up. Like I had never really thought of that. I mean, like I knew that's what people did, but I didn't know what it would feel like to do. So like there's lots of real stuff in the novel. But there are all kinds of made up people, and like, you know, the character is, I don't have much overlap with him in terms of things that happen in the book, but, you know, like I invited this conflation, right? I mean, he's from Topeka. Like one of the poems he has in the book is one of my poems. Like his parents are psychologists. He has this friend called Cyrus. So there is all this invitation to read, you know, the overlap. But I guess, I mean, my answer to the question is mainly just to say that it's not something I have an answer to do. It's something I think something I think that like literature poses as a question, right? Like that I don't write the novel with an answer to the messy intersections of art and life and mind so much as the novel occurs to me as a way to dramatize the complexity of those intersections, right? And like the chat isn't, I mean, it's not like cut and pasted, but it does, you know, it does involve like events and people, but there's, I mean, let me give you an example of like another way that art and life intersect even within the book, right? Which like there are two poems in the novel. One is this poem he reads at this kind of hilariously bad poetry reading, and that poem is made out of language of the novel, right? Like all of that poem that he reads is made out of language of the novel. And what interested me about that, I mean, it's not very long, it's just like an excerpt, but like what interested me about that was how it would dramatize, in a way related to this conversation about virtuality and actuality, like the fact that that can't be a real poem. And it can't be a real poem because the character wouldn't have had access to the language of the novel in an event that precedes its writing. The second poem, so that's already a kind of interaction between the world of the life of this character and the writtenness of that life in the novel. The other poem is a poem from the Lichtenberg figures, which from my first book of poems that's like in this magazine that he kind of looks at when he's in Spain. And what I was interested in there is that it's like really a different poem in the novel, right? It's a different, like the words are the same, but it's a different poem in the world of the novel than it is in the book. So even though it's a transposition of the exact same text, I liked the way it felt how much context determines our experience of a work. And I like how novels can construct different worlds in which the poems are received as opposed to the world we have, so that those different like diegetic crossings or those different layers of artifice are the book. Like that's what the book is made out of. I did worry though. Like I do, like one of the dangers about writing a novel is that people might read it, unlike your in-laws will read it and stuff like that. And it has been interesting. I mean, it has been interesting because no one will believe you when you say that part of it's made up or what. I mean, like everyone reads it biographically, but everyone does that anyway. So to a certain degree, the question, and this is what I mean to say, like. No one is not writing something intensely personal, right? The question is, do you incorporate the problematic relationship between art and life into the work, right? Or do you make that extra textual? And for me, it's always more interesting to write that complex of issues into the project, to bring it within the domain of the criticizable or the domain of the fiction or the domain of the book. I don't know. I mean, I was like, I didn't mean to write it. I really didn't mean to write a novel. And in fact, a lot of the novel, like when I was revising the novel, which took a lot longer than writing the novel. I mean, really, it feels like most of the novel, like writing it was revising it, because I wrote all these words and then I cut it back. So it felt very subtractive. But like one of the things I had to really minimize was how like everything in the book was in the conditional. And I realized that like part of it was that like as I was writing it, I was so resistant to the idea of writing a novel that I was kind of always saying like, if I were writing a novel, like this would happen. And part of that links up, to the kind of the character. I mean, part of the narrator of the novel has a similarly kind of mediated, anxious relation to the virtuality of all his experience. But I think I was also like resisting the idea of actually committing to a genre. But I didn't choose to, so I was even resistant to writing a novel, but did write a novel. Now I'm working mainly on poems. I mean, I think of poetry as poetry is the center for me, but it's the center for me in part because it's impossible, right? Because like I'll never figure out how to do it. And so all the writing I do to some degree is this idea of like starting with an impossible project and then figuring out how it becomes a record, like how it becomes some other thing out of that originary impulse. So like maybe that'll be a novel, or maybe it'll be, a prose poem or whatever. Like so genres are like different forms that the failure of the poetic impulse takes from it, but they always come back to poetry. I mean, I just wrote this essay, which like I haven't really done before, like not an academic essay, and it was all the same thing for me. It was like, first I wanted to write a poem, then I thought maybe I would make it some kind of fiction, and then it wasn't that. And then like the essay that I got interested in as a form for me, only materialized in my narrative as this kind of deflected way of dodging all these different actual instantiations that were totally unacceptable to me, if that makes sense. And it doesn't have to be this neurotic. There are other ways of describing it, I think, that are less neurotic sounding, but this is kind of how I do it.
Well, listening to you, I'm reminded of something Henry Moore, the British sculptor, said about life. Do only one thing and make sure it's something you can't do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's good. I'm reassured to hear that. Yeah.
You go.
Oh, no.
I was just what you said about how you tend to start poems. I sympathize with the idea of starting poems by coming up with an impossible project and then see how it goes from there. My problem is that a lot of times the project is conceptual ideal, some ideal of how I can use language in such a way to accomplish some end, which is usually abstract. And then once I get down to the particulars, like this goes back to what you were saying about how you can exploit the the inherent failure of poetry as something that's constitutive as opposed to a reason to turn away from it. But I was just wondering if you could give particulars about how you actually finish poems when you're doing these impossible projects. I know you cut, you do a lot of different techniques with the construction, but I mean, it still doesn't produce a good poem. It still is difficult, and I'm wondering how you, continue forward if a project is looking.
Yeah, well, so it's a really good question. I mean, one thing, I make up these I make up these fictions about the book, right? Like I say, I'm doing this thing, or I have this organizing metaphor. It's a projection, so I decide that, now it's kind of hard for me to distinguish between what it was actually like to write a book and the fiction I created about the writing of the book in order to be able to write it. But I do know with Mean Free Path, I'm just writing lines. It has no title, I have no idea, I'm just trying to write. I'm just kind of listening to the language. And then I'm kind of well, this looks like a stanza. It's or maybe I'll start to feel that I'm making these 9-line stanzas. I do it 2 or 3 times. And then I say, okay, that's a rule now. So you re-describe a contingent thing as a rule, and then you have something to work against. Okay, well now I have to do that. It's no longer just me starting from scratch. So how am I going to manage that? And then if you have a couple pages of it, so Mean Free Path is 18 pages of 18 lines on a page, except then I broke that rule for the first stanza, 10 lines instead of 9. But making these arbitrary constraints that you generate rules that you can then be pushed and pulled by, that's part of the generation of the fiction of the book. Oh, so it's that kind of book. It's a book of these. Now at least I know how many lines are in a stanza, right? And then more generally, the great thing about sequences, I think, is that they let you write your anxiety about the book into the book. That can become a manner. That can become a problem. But it does allow you to talk back to the rules as they develop in a way that doesn't make you feel like you have to know. Then it makes you're kind of listening and recording what it's like to try to write the book into the book. There's that feedback that can be propulsive, And then at some place, I get this thematic, then the thematic concerns emerge out of the formal stuff. And it's I am writing a love poem. I keep wanting to see how to use this woman's name in the poem in a way that has a rightness of fit. And so then you start talking about that difficulty or kind of thematizing that. And then I think, well, maybe it's a love poem. So then I put myself on a diet of love poems and try to figure out what's happening there and what can be an example for me and what, negative or positive. So it's just and then at the end, it's I'm writing this book. It's I have this idea about the book, right? But that idea is really has changed and as Wittgenstein talks about that sense of being able to go on, right? That instead of the ontological questions, his question is how is the ability to just go on. And that for me is as close as I get to inspiration, is that sense that I can go on. That's possible that I've found a form that makes that possible. I mean, I'm almost always wrong, right? I mean, it's almost always I can go on for a little bit and then it doesn't go anywhere. But then every once in a while it feels like you could write it all the way through.
And I'm sorry, just a follow up on if those rules you set for yourself turn out to be so restrictive that it's like just like really hard to make it come to any fruition. Are those abandoned, appropriated in different forms?
All those things, whatever works, right? I mean, like, and the Creeley poems that matter most to me are like in For Love, right? Like, the reason why failure registers so strongly, like this enabling failure, so strongly in For Love is because of the restriction of the quatrains. Like, if it were all one stanza, or if they were irregular stanza pairings, I wouldn't feel a sensibility really confronting the limitation of this traditional poetic container. And I think it's important to think of poetic form and traditional forms not as a container, but as a generative restraint. So for me, I feel like I gotta have something that's, because that then thematizes the social, right? The restriction of the form. And then your wrestling match with the restriction of the form is the dialectic out of which your voice emerges. Like, you don't have a voice that's other than your encounter in time with some kind of imposed form, whether it's pentameter or something you made up, or a quatrain, or something totally, But like that said, like I don't know. Yeah, I mean, the best and worst thing about this stuff, I think, is that like having written a poem somehow doesn't teach you at all like how to do it again, which is very upsetting to me. But also, it's like, it's why you don't it's why it's inexhaustible. Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about dreams. That's a perfect example. Like, every time I have a dream, it's not a guarantee that I'm going to have another one. We have faith that we're going to have a dream again. I'm the same way with poems.
Yeah.
As I've written a poem, I'm going to write another one, which is like, a huge sense of anxiety for me personally. But I was thinking about dreams, especially in terms of, I feel really invested in arguing with you about how you're talking about failure and impossibility, I think, for some reason. And that, dreams have been said to kind of show us what's impossible in our lives. But at the same time, the dream happened, like it actually exists, and it has made that possible. I'm kind of thinking about the poem and now the novel, and the way that you talked about the novel as doing that in different ways, and like that kind of exploration as exploring manifesting language as making those things possible, not as failures of like what life can't give us, but that we can actually make those things possible. And I guess that's not a question.
No, I know what you mean. I mean, I think that when people talk about literature as having kind of something similar to a dream function, I think it's right, but I think there's like a dangerous version of that, and there's like the idea of literature as and like as Frederick Jameson puts it, as an imaginary solution to a real problem, right? That like literature is like a dream in the sense that it's a compensatory fiction that allows you to return to the damaged life, right? So there's that kind of danger. And there's also the danger of the privacy of the dream. I'm just thinking out loud about the dream as I imagine it, right? But I agree that part of one way to think about literature is it's an attempt to make social the privacy of a dream and to insist on its reality. But the thing, like when I was like a little kid, I still like find myself, how when you're describing a dream you had and it's like dissolving so fast that you can't really tell anymore when you're describing it or when you're writing it, like when you're lying about it, like that's always been so fundamental to dream, and that's like the moment that links it to literature with me. It's like the same thing like the fiction of the book. Like I had this idea for a poem, now I'm writing out that idea, but really you don't remember the originary impulse. It's like too fundamental, or maybe it was never even there. Maybe it's like a fiction you manufacture after the fact. So, I mean, the dream is kind of real, but the gulf between the dream, but then it's like, the dream becomes real. The reality of the dream that counts for me is the dream you make up in the act of composition, and not the actually like psychological prehistory, like the impulse. Like the impulse always is betrayed by putting it into words, but that can also be where you discover the content of the dream, right? Like an analysis doesn't just analyze your dream, they analyze the language you use in recounting your dream. You know? Yeah. Sure.
We have time for a last question if anyone's... Great. Well, thanks, Ben. That was
Thank
great.
you very
Thank
much.